workshop. Yeah, as you can see, history as tragedy, comedy, and farce. We will see how far we will get. First of all, thanks to the Center for Arts and Humanities for hosting us today. We are very, very pleased that we could bring 4 speakers for today. I will introduce them one by one once they have their speaking slot. So I will start with Aaron Schuster, but before I will just say a couple of remarks on today's program. I will moderate this session and also the other sessions together with Nadia Bouali in the first row. You probably know her. And before I will introduce Aaron Schuster, I also wanted to make an announcement that tomorrow at 5 p.m. at Lysiane, Hamra Street, very close by, we will have a book launch event also with Aaron Schuster and his upcoming book, The Trouble with Pleasure.
Yeah, you have to come, I guess, if you're here. It's pretty much.
And by the way, another announcement, which was actually not planned, but remember last November when I promised you to, when Samuel Končić was speaking, I promised you to bring the book to Beirut.
Did you?
The package arrived today. I have no idea why this coincidence, but tomorrow this book will also be on sale. Just you have another additional reason that you do not need to come, but for sure you can buy the book, and also later at the break there will be a possibility to purchase this book. So, and also one more announcement. Later on, I mean, I don't know how many people will be over the day. We have a reading session. So, as you can imagine, we won't do the work for you. A workshop means you have to work. So it will not be that we will produce basically a pre-digested input for you and you can just accept it or not. We will have to read together certain passages which are key to also the title. You imagine which one. It's the famous passage in Marx. Actually, there are 3 passages, and from then on we will develop our own discussion. So don't get confused with this kind of seating order. Later it will be, as those who attend my seminars know very well, you have to come to the table and be part of the work. Sure. So Aaron Schuster, I will introduce you now. My friend, colleague, comrade, Aaron Schuster is a former fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Rijeka, Croatia, with an almost similar beautiful CU, and the Institute for Cultural Inquiry, ICI in Berlin. He's head of the theory program at Zandberg, still, Amsterdam, and will be a visiting professor at the University of Chicago in 2016. He's author of the book launch tomorrow, The Trouble with Pleasure, Deleuze and Psychoanalysis, MIT Press. So without further ado, the word is to you, and we have roughly 30 minutes.
Okay.
Some questions, and then we go into
just brutally cut me off if I go too long. So, you know, to kind of launch the workshop, I've chosen actually what I consider a very interesting and provocative sort of introduction to the theme. But the difficulty is it's a very long and complex text, so I can't really do it justice. I simply want to introduce it. Has anybody here read or is familiar with the play of Jean Genet called The Balcony? I'm just curious if anybody... Okay. So I would like to sort of make a plea for this play, in a sense. I mean, to encourage you to look at this play, which I consider one of the most important works of political theater in the 20th century. And I think it's especially relevant now, perhaps even more relevant now to our times than when it was written, which was the late 1950s. And it went through a number of revisions. I believe the text was established in its final version either in 1960 or 1962. Why do I consider this text so relevant? Because basically it's a play about the success of the counter-revolution. It's a play that analyzes the failure of the revolution and the success of the counter-revolution. It does this by analyzing the fantasies that subtend both the powers that be, so the fantasies that subtend, that support the established order, but also the fantasies that are at work in the revolutionary cause. So it makes for, let me say, if one reads it today in a somewhat naive way, you can immediately sort of transpose Genet's references to more contemporary situations. And one thinks especially of the Arab Spring in that connection. I also think it's a very good work for introducing the general theme of the conference or workshop. In a seminar, you get inseminated. In a workshop, you have to work, right? Okay, so the theme of the workshop, which would be, the way I would reformulate it maybe, would be tragedy and comedy, sort of between history and repetition. But of course, there's actually three terms, and that's kind of an open question I have. There's three terms. We're dealing not only with tragedy and comedy, but with tragedy, comedy, and farce. So my first question is, what differentiates comedy and farce? And I think to give a very basic answer to that, but okay, that's just a starting point, is we take the idea of farce from, we'll be looking at this later, but from the text of Marx, that somehow history first acts in a kind of tragic mode, kind of valiant cause that fails, and then this cause gets taken up and repeated in a farcical, i.e. ridiculous and meaningless mode. So the question is there another kind of repetition that would not simply be a farcical, empty, meaningless, ridiculous, stupid, okay, banalizing form of the original tragic struggle? Could there also be a comic repetition, or a comedy that wouldn't simply be a farce? That's one way of posing the problem. There might be others, okay? So let me tell you a little bit about this play. It's organized into 9 scenes. The balcony is the name of a brothel. So it's called the Grand Balcony. And in this brothel, clients come to to have very specific kinds of services. And in fact, what they do is they come to the brothel in order to play figures of power. So they dress up as, and in a very farcical, kind of ridiculous way, but they dress up as different sort of figures of power. And in the first 3 scenes, sort of set up these scenarios inside of the brothel. So the first scene involves a client playing a bishop, and these people are presumably coming from sort of a bourgeois classes, middle class. A bishop, a judge, and a general. The 4th scene involves a kind of interesting character who actually goes downward, wants to play a beggar. So somebody, a lumpenproletariat, the lowest classes of society. And so we get these scenes where people come to play these power roles. In the 5th scene of the play, which is much longer, then we're introduced to the madam of the house, Madame Irma, and to her kind of right-hand lady, Carmen. Now we discovered that at the same time that the bourgeois is coming over to kind of play out and to enjoy these roles of power, there's a revolution going on outside. So inside the brothel, which is essentially a very sophisticated theater, inside the brothel we have the bourgeois playing out these scenes of power and enjoying them. And outside there's a revolution going on. So that always during the scenes they're being interrupted. They're being interrupted in 2 ways. Either the scene is not being played out quite right, so there's very funny sort of dialogues where one character is suggesting, no, you shouldn't cry now, you have to wait, don't confess quite yet. You have to... So there's kind of this internal direction, but the scene is also broken by gunfire. So somehow machine gun fire is punctuating what's going on outside. So you know that something is happening outside this realm of illusions. And everybody's quite concerned about the revolution, which seems to be succeeding. The rebels are getting closer and closer, killing more people. They're going to storm the brothel. Now, Irma's ex-lover is the chief of police, George. But that's finished now. She's now with Arthur. Arthur plays in the brothel. He plays the role of the executioner. He's a big kind of brutish character. And Irma is trying to find out, when is the chief of police going to come? When is George going to come to assure us things are going okay? Now, George finally arrives, and there's one running gag throughout the entire play. I mean, the real joke of the play, the central joke, is George, so the chief of police comes, and everybody's worried about, okay, the revolution. When are you going to restore order? Are we going to be safe? But George actually only has one real preoccupation. He keeps asking, hey, is anybody coming to the brothel to ask to play me? So the chief of police wants to know if anybody comes to the brothel and dresses up as the chief of police. And the answer is no. Nobody wants to play the chief of police. So let me read a little passage to give you the flavor of the play. So the chief of police is speaking to Carmen. Are you pulling my leg, Carmen? I'm asking you whether I'm in it. Carmen, whether you're in it. Irma, ironically, you're not in it. The chief of police, not yet. Well, yes or no? Is there a simulation? Carmen, a simulation. The chief of police, you idiot, yes, an impersonation of the chief of police. Long silence. Irma, the time's not right. My dear, your function isn't noble enough to offer dreamers an image that would console them. Perhaps it lacks illustrious ancestors. No, my dear fellow, you have to resign yourself to the fact that your image does not yet conform to the liturgies of the brothel. So this is quite interesting. Everybody wants to play these illustrious sort of power roles, but the chief of police, and the play makes it absolutely clear that the only thing that's holding together the state at that point is the chief of police, who represents force and violence. He's somehow the last resort of order. But insofar as he incarnates, so the violence of the state, no one wants to play him. There's no glory attached to his role. One thinks somehow of the secret police here, the dirty police that nobody wants to play. Everybody would like to be a general, for example, or a great clergyman, or something like that, or a judge, a noble judge. Somehow the police is a dirty role that, garners no sort of fascination or respect. The police has no image, and that's part of its power, you could say. Okay, so that's the running gag throughout the entire play. Now, in scene 6, what we learn is that one of the prostitutes has run away from the brothel. She actually managed to escape to the outside, Chantal, and she's joined the revolution. And she is in a couple with Roger. So Roger. Roger is one of the revolutionaries, idealistic revolutionaries. Now, Chantal has not only joined the revolution, but because she's such a great actress, because after all, that's what you learn in the brothel is to act, she somehow becomes the very face of the revolution, the image of the revolution, so that the revolution takes her over to kind of propagandize their cause. And there's even a very funny bidding war where one sector of the revolution, one cadre, actually wants to take Chantal from Roger, and they're willing to give him 100 other women, slaves, or whatever. They kind of start bargaining for this prostitute in a very sort of dirty way. But she becomes the kind of image of the revolution, and insofar as she becomes the image of the revolution is betrayed. So the police chief understands that once Chantal actually becomes the face of the revolution itself is a game. And that's what he says. The revolution is a game. Just like the game you're playing inside the brothel, the revolution is another kind of game with its own fantasies and its own attachment to images. And especially, Genet will emphasize it throughout, an image is something frozen, something immobile. He talks a lot about this desire for immobility, which he also associates with death. In scene 7, we're back in the brothel, and the brothel has created now a kind of new studio, which would be the ultimate studio, which is a gigantic mausoleum. So they're building a huge tomb, like a pyramid or something for a pharaoh. So that will be sort of the ultimate scene will be played out in this mausoleum, where consecrating yourself in the glory of the image will also be a kind of entombing oneself or kind of death for eternity. Now, the revolution is about ready to succeed. What happens is this. In the end, the envoy comes from the queen. The queen apparently is the head of the state. There's a monarchy. The king, I don't know. There's a queen. Is the queen dead or not? There's wonderful dialogue about this. The envoy is extremely equivocal. He keeps saying things like, the queen is embroidering and she's not embroidering. The queen is doing this and she's not doing that. Which kind of emphasizes the fact that the queen is more a symbolic function or symbolic role and not a real person wielding power. So one of the underlying sort of themes throughout the play is that the roles are detached from persons. So there's very basic, you could also say very basic Lacanian insight that the symbolic order is autonomous from the real persons who have to inhabit it. So the bishop, the judge, for example, the general are symbolic identifications or symbols which are autonomous from the people who inhabit them. And to inhabit these roles in a pure way is in a way to die. Your individuality dies, but you attain a kind of pure image. So what happens is this: how is the state going to rally to its cause when it's on the point of losing the battle? And it's suggested that Irma herself should just become the new queen, that she should dress up as the queen to show that the state is still strong. And in fact, what happens is all the clients in the brothel who are playing these roles simply become them. They're forced to assume them, to show that the state actually is viable. So the bishop now has to become a bishop. The person playing a judge has to start judging. And the general has to actually start leading men. So they show up on the balcony. Okay, so now the balcony of the balcony. Remember, the name of the whorehouse is the Grand Balcony. And the reason why I titled my presentation All the Worlds of the Whorehouse is a kind of wink to Shakespeare. But in a sense, Genet is also in this modernist tradition of not only showing an action, but showing an action that's already theatricalized. So we have theater within a theater, a play within a play, like in Hamlet, Mousetrap scene. There's a play within a play. It's about this play within a play is in a brothel. So the brothel is the stage. So if all the world was a stage for Shakespeare, for Genet we get all the world somehow is this kind of whorehouse. And we're all sort of kind of prostitutes in this sense. So, but the balcony of the balcony, so you have to imagine the actual, the balcony is this space where people come out and they present themselves to the outside world. So you have all the clients come out and Irma, and they show that in fact the state is fully viable, that all these symbolic functions are still working. And this actually rallies people to their cause, and it seems as if the revolution will be squashed, will be destroyed. At that moment, Chantal is actually hit by a bullet, so she dies. And then we enter into scene 9, which is about, again, stage managing the appearances of the new state. So there's kind of a wonderful scene with paparazzi, all these photographers, managing all these great images, pictures, and so forth. But the most interesting part, so the end of the play, scene 9, is when when Roger, the defeated revolutionary, comes to the whorehouse. And what does he do? He comes to play the chief of police. So the defeated revolutionary will finally come to play the chief of police, and therefore to fulfill the fantasy of the chief of police, that finally somebody will actually incarnate his role. And the only one who could incarnate that role would be the failed revolutionary. Now, let me read another passage. Now, how would you impersonate the chief of police? That's the question. How would you dress up as the chief of police? And he has a very specific proposal. Let me read that passage. Yes. So the envoys, they're discussing again. The chief of police is asking again, is anybody coming to play me? Is anybody coming to play me? The envoy says, nobody's come yet. Nobody has yet felt the need to abolish himself in your fascinating image. The chief of police, nothing, nobody. The queen, nobody. And yet the blinds have been drawn again. The men ought to be coming in. So the business is starting up again. Besides, the apparatus has been set up so it will be informed by a full pair of bells. Another small detail that's quite nice is that Irma has a kind of a surveillance device, so she can watch what's going on in the different rooms. I always thought a film was made of this play, but it's not interesting at all. But I always thought a good director for this would be Soderbergh, for some reason, Steven Soderbergh. It's kind of sexualized and videotape feeling. There's this kind of surveillance. Or, of course, you can also think of Buñuel. Buñuel, how close to the spirit is. So the envoy says, so you didn't care for the project I submitted to you this morning, yet that's the image that haunts you and that ought to haunt the others. Chief of police, it's ineffectual. The envoy, the executioner's red coat and his axe. So they're looking at different sort of designs, let's say. Chief of police, I'm afraid that they fear and envy a man, but not a wrinkle, for example, or curl, or cigar, or wit. The latest image that you proposed to me, I hardly dare mention it to you. The judge, was it very audacious? So here's the chief of police's proposal. Very, too audacious. I never dare tell you what it is. Gentlemen, I have sufficient confidence in your judgment and devotion. After all, I want to carry on the fight by boldness of ideas as well. And it was this. I've been advised to appear in the form of a gigantic phallus, a prick of great stature. George, you, the chief of police, what do you expect if I'm to symbolize the nation? The envoy, allow me, madame. It's the tone of the age. The judge, a phallus of great stature? You mean enormous? The chief of police, of my stature. Now this is of course the kind of comic apex of the play, that the state should incarnate itself in the form of a gigantic penis, and that the chief of police literally is a dickhead. So what happens, Roger comes, and he actually fulfills then the fantasy of becoming the chief of police. So he plays the police chief, and let me just read from the end of his performance, but he's kind of constantly going a little bit off script. So when one of the prostitutes, Carmen, is kind of playing the scene with him, she's suggesting, well, he's kind of going off script or suggesting things a bit outside of how the performance should go. So, the apex of the kind of height of the performance then is again this kind of homage to the image. So Carmen says, the truth is that then you're dead. So he will descend to the mausoleum, because of course he's dead insofar as he will live forever in this image that now is detached from him. So you don't, or the phrasing in Genet is very beautiful. It's rather that you don't stop dying, and that your image, like your name, reverberates to infinity. Roger, he knows that my image is everywhere. Carmen, yes, inscribed and engraved and imposed by fear. Roger, in the palms of the stevedores, in the games of children, on the teeth of soldiers, in war. Carmen, everywhere. The chief of police. So I've made it. The queen, are you happy? The chief of police, you've done a good job. That puts the finishing touch to your house. And then Roger, still, is it in the prisons? Is it in the wrinkles of old people? Carmen, it is. Roger, is it in the curves of the roads? Carmen, you mustn't ask me impossible. So this idea that his image will reverberate throughout everything. Now, what happens then? Roger suddenly does something else. At the very end, he says, I have to go to the very limit of his destiny, of the police chief's destiny, but of my destiny as well, or merging his destiny with mine. Carmen tries to make him leave. She opens a door, then another, then a third, unable to find the right one. Roger takes out a knife, and with his back to the audience, makes the gesture of castrating himself. The queen, on my rugs, on the new carpet, he's a lunatic. Carmen, crying out, doing that here, she yells. Madam, Madame Irma. Carmen finally manages to drag Roger out. The queen rushes from the room, all the other characters, the chief of police, the envoy from the queen, the judge, the general, the bishop. They turn and leave. The chief of police moves forward to the middle of the stage. Chief of police. Well played. He thought that he had me. Then he places his hands on his zipper. He very visibly feels his balls, and reassured, he heaves a sigh. Mine are still here. So which of us is washed up, he or I? Though my image may be castrated in every brothel in the world, I remain intact. Intact, gentlemen. And then he adds, that plumber, because Roger actually comes from working classes, so he's a plumber. He says, that plumber didn't know how to handle his role. That's it. Okay. Well, that's about it. That's a quick summary of the play. Now, what do I want to leave you with here? One moment. Well, maybe we can come back to this. I wanted to look at a couple quotes now from some of our reading from Alenka Zupancic from her book on comedy. And one of the quotes, so I'll just summarize it, actually deals with the idea, how do you distinguish tragedy and comedy? And one of the interesting sort of suggestions she has is, you'll notice that tragedies usually have the names of proper characters, Hamlet, Othello, whereas tragedies have the names of, comedies have the names of kind of generic situations, all's well that ends well, or the comedy of errors or so. Whereas tragedy starts with somehow a singular destiny that gets caught up in a kind of impossibility, or it moves from a singular destiny, the concrete person, to some kind of abstract ideal. Comedy somehow works in reverse, that it starts from an abstract situation that is then incarnated in specific characters. And the balcony is an interesting case in point, because the balcony, it's not about, it's not about a character, and in fact, the characters here are all functions. I mean, there are some named characters, but the real characters are the chief of police, the bishop, and so on. So we're dealing with symbolic functions that are detachable. But the balcony also names, so this kind of interesting transition point. So it's a generic space, and it stands for theater as such. But within the theater, it also stands for a kind of point of transition. So on the one hand, you have the brothel, which is the stage, the space of illusion. On the other hand, you have the outside world, which is the revolution. So let's say reality. But this distinction between reality, let's say, and fantasy, reality and illusion, reality and appearance, is constantly getting jumbled up in the play. So that there's indices of reality within the illusion, but also in the outside reality, we see that the revolution is also playing a game and caught up in images. And the point of transition between the two seems to be that balcony, that space that connects the brothel and the outside world. Now I think, so this is also a general proposition that we can look at in other ways, in other texts. But I think to properly understand this work, or to give a good interpretation, we have to resist two temptations. One would be to suggest that there is simply a clear line of demarcation between reality and fantasy. The brothel setting for fantasy, the reality being the real of the revolution. So that's one possible reading. And in fact, Alain Badiou, who's one of the few philosophers, he really also latches onto this play as contemporary to our condition. But he tends to move in the direction of a clear demarcation line between the reality, the image, and the real of the revolution. The other reading that I think we ought to be suspicious of is to say there is no distinction between reality and fantasy, that the two are always already somehow jumbled up, that we live in a world of illusions, we live in a world of simulation. We could call that a postmodern reading. So instead there seems to be a point of transition and a point of transformation, but it's very difficult to seize what that point is between reality and fantasy. And somehow the balcony, so not just the name of the whorehouse, but the actual balcony space, where the actors are practically entering into the audience, is that point of mediation somehow between the two. And then I'll just conclude by reading, so this short statement, but it's very interesting and very provocative, that Genet appended to the play. So it's called the avertissement, or the kind of introduction. So let me read that in full, and then I'll end with that point. He says, when the problem of a certain disorder or of evil has been solved on stage, this shows that in fact it has been abolished, since according to the dramatic conventions of our time, a theatrical representation can only be the representation of a fact. We can then turn our minds to something else and allow our hearts to swell with pride, seeing that we took the side of the hero who aimed successfully at finding the solution. Now, no problem that has been exposed ought to be solved in the imagination, especially when the dramatist has made every effort to show the concrete reality of the social order. I think that's what Genet is trying to do, show concrete reality of the social order and how it functions. On the contrary, the evil shown on stage should explode, should show us naked and leave us distraught if possible, having no recourse other than ourselves. The function of the artist or the poet, and here I underline that term function, because if you read the play, you'll see that word is used throughout. The function. What is the function? The function of the show. What is the function of the artist who would depict this? So the function of the artist and the poet is not finding a practical solution to the problems of evil. They should accept to be damned. They will lose their soul if they have one, and that doesn't matter. But their work will be an active explosion, an act starting from which the public reacts as it pleases, as it can. If the good is to appear in a work of art, it does so through the divine aid of the powers of song, whose strength alone is enough to magnify the evil that has been exposed. But, and here's something interesting, that he ends on a very critical point towards artists. Today, some poets engage in a curious operation. They sing the people, freedom, the revolution, etc., which, by being sung, are precipitated and then nailed down to an abstract sky where they figure defeated and deflated in deformed constellations. Disincarnated, they become untouchable. How can one approach them, love them, make them alive, if they have been sent so magnificently far away? Written down, sometimes very richly, they become the signs of a poem, poetry being nostalgia and a song that destroys its own pretext. Our poets kill that which they would love to make alive. That's how he concludes on a kind of interesting critical note towards the function of artists and the relationship of artists to political praxis. So I'll end with that. Now I know I only sort of scratched the surface. I'm just giving you kind of a summary of the play. But perhaps we'll see how it goes in the workshop. Perhaps some of these issues will kind of return in our discussion of specific texts. But I'm happy sort of, if there's time to take some initial questions, discussion.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Aaron, for this introduction first. Yeah, let's use the 15 minutes as a transition already to the reading. I mean, it will be in the end, but I think we should allow for questions because you already have raised basically the issue, the theme of the entire workshop day. I mean, this distinction between, or the problem of the distinction of fantasy and reality, how they are intermingled, neither distinguishable nor just the same, and we're playing in a strict postmodern way. And what is the distinction, if there is one, between farcical and comical repetition mapped on the two, on the distinction of fantasy and reality? I think the floor is open. We should collect some questions, and then afterwards I would invite the panel, all the speakers to come up and in roles and character masks will read out certain passages from Marx that echo a little bit your introduction.
But yeah, if you have some, maybe just start with some reactions to
maybe one question to you.
Yeah.
Because you were talking about it before, you said the play is actually about a counter-revolution. And when we read Marx, we see that there's sort of another form of repetition that sort of has to do with revolution, which in Genet's play, it's a play, again, it's kind of a game, but they don't, it doesn't seem that they don't play roles in the way that roles are being played in the brothel. So, what I mean? So, Marx talking about sort of how the revolutionaries dressing up, and there's a form of sort of repetition of costumes and so on. So this is the one kind of sort of repetition, and then there's another form of repetition which is in the brothel, which is essentially in a way they are sort of repeating the characters that are at stake in the revolution.
Right.
So the counter-revolutionary movement sort of repeating what is actually happening in the revolution. So I would love to hear your take on that, on the differences between these two, like Marx on the one side, 18th Brumaire, and then Genet, counter-revolution, repeating sort of characters that are at stake in the revolution, like the judge and the general and so on. So.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Maybe a way to do this would be to think through the role of the plumber. I mean, the moment of castration. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, because I think the way Lacan describes it in Seminar 5, he says the proletarian revolution has always believed in the success of morality.
Right.
And I wonder if you could, if you could think through your question in relationship to this, the role of the plumber. What happens there with this moment of castration on stage?
Okay. Let me make a quick attempt at an interpretation. What's going on in this scene at the end of the play, which is the kind of height of comedy, and as Lacan point out it's about comedy has to do with this revelation of the phallus. And the phallus in the play will be the symbol of all symbols, but of the last resort of power somehow. Again, the cop is a dickhead and is really the linchpin of the established order, or the symbolic order. Now, what happens there? One could say that what Roger does or tries to do is something deeply subversive. That he wants to strike not only at the person responsible, but he wants to strike at their very dignity, at their very image. So he wants to actually destroy the attraction. He actually wants to destroy the kind of phallic aura of the police. And he does that by incarnating the police and then castrating himself. So he tries to strike directly. And this also reminds me, for example, of the problem of Hamlet in a certain way. That, you know, why can't Hamlet assassinate Claudius? At least his explanation is he doesn't want to just kill Claudius, but he wants to actually strike at his very being, his being a king. And how do you kill a king? So this is part of how does a revolutionary actually cut off the head of the king? In this case, how does a revolutionary actually cut off the penis of the cop? Okay, so that's the kind of general problem. Now, what's interesting here is that Roger fails. So the police chief can say in the end, though my image may be castrated in every brothel on the planet, I'm still intact. And then he descends into his mausoleum to sort of exist or to live on for thousands and thousands of years. Now, I think on this point, as opposed to most interpreters of the play, you know, psychoanalysis can be quite helpful here. And that's because what psychoanalysis, so the psychoanalytic theory of phallus or phallic identification, is that phallus is already castrated. It's not that the phallus incarnates a certain power which then can be destroyed, ruined, or whatnot, but that its very power somehow lies in its powerlessness. So this is a kind of theme that if you read also, probably one of the best summaries of this is found in Alenka Zupančić's book on comedy in a chapter on the phallus, and the phallus is a comic object. So if you're interested in going into that, like I can really recommend that as a very good way into the topic. But somehow Roger, so I think this is what Genet is saying, that Roger, Roger somehow misrecognizes how power functions, and specifically he misrecognizes how the fantasy that sustains power functions. So he thinks that by directly attacking, denigrating that image, he'll be able to destroy its spell. And Genet then shows a certain failure of a revolutionary, let's say, ideology critique. That the policeman will still survive. Now, this is foreshadowed throughout the entire play, and you have to look at all the passages where Genet talks about the detachable image. He's constantly talking about the detachability of the image. And in the end, you could say that what the policeman says is, you know, me being the phallus, of course it's castrated, like it's the ultimate image that's detached. So now I'm coming back to Jan's question, that what the people, when they go to play a bishop or a general and so forth, they don't want to be, and that's something that Genet is also exploiting. I don't want to be a bishop if I play a bishop. I want to be a pure image, a pure appearance. And what I enjoy is appearance qua appearance. Now, the ideology critique of Genet could be something like this. Society has to be organized according to different functions and different roles. But it also creates a kind of perverse side pleasure. Now, you can, if you know sort of ABCs of Freud, Freud's definition of sexuality is that, of course, the body has all sorts of needs, but it tends to get diverted from those needs into the enjoyment of the activities that are used to satisfy those needs. Okay? So I need to eat, okay, but I also discovered that I simply enjoy sucking on things, for instance, and that becomes detached from eating. So the sexuality is somehow a diversion away from a functional or practical. Now, we could also say the same thing about the way the society is structured according to different rules. That, of course, all these rules have a specific practical mandate. But there's a certain kind of excess pleasure, or a certain pleasure that's generated just in playing that role. That's above actually executing the actions that role is meant to do. So there's a kind of surplus pleasure in just being a judge, incarnating that role of a judge, apart from the pleasure you might have in judging well, let's say, or in actually exercising your duties. And when these characters, when the bourgeois comes to the brothel, it's to enjoy that pure appearance without any function at all. So you could say in Freudian terms, it's purely sexual in a certain sense. It's really detached from the practical function. And you could say that in order for society to work, there's always this kind of fantasy substrate. It's not just you're doing something, but you also unconsciously or in fantasy enjoy the role you inhabit. And that enjoyment never fully coincides with the practical function. So that's something. So this is what the repetition in Genet is about. And then the end of the play is extremely ambiguous because you don't know. There's more machine gun fire, and you don't know actually is the revolution coming back? Is that the police slaughtering people? And the play simply ends with Irma, who's kind of this ultimate capitalist master because she's just counting money. And because she's fully immersed in the spectacle, she's running the brothel, she's actually the one least fascinated by it. She's just counting money. And at the end, the end of the play is basically she's complaining about the fact that, geez, it costs a lot for all the electricity, to put on all these spectacles. So the play ends very ambiguously, and I think you could also read it in a very somber, it's a very depressing ending. That somehow we're always caught in these kind of fantasies and there's no escape from it. So I don't think that that's actually Genet's message. And if you look at his introduction, he seems to suggest otherwise, that the artist is somehow who lays bare the fantasy and lets it explode. Whereas the false artist is the one who is singing about the glories of the people, freedom, and revolution. And that those tend to be very easily co-opted. So that's my sorry, long answer.
I want to ask about the symbolism of the balcony, because I think it could, my reading of it is it could symbolize class consciousness of the actors who, in a very performative role, assume their role as the clergy, the judge, and the other building block of the ideological state apparatuses. And all these transition phases between reality and fantasy seem to be like class consciousness, even for Chantal when she passes on to the revolutionary side. So could this be another reading for...
I don't know. I mean, could you say... also, let me say that I just started working on this play. So this is also... I don't have a definitive answers in a sense. I'm kind of curious what interpretation we can come up with. So could you push that a little further? Because, yeah, one thing though seems clear to me, and that's in those early scenes, when the bourgeois are playing these roles, I have a hard time immediately saying it's somehow awakening of a consciousness because they're very aware of the fact that they want to be pure appearances. So they want to just be the appearance of a judge as a pure appearance. And that they're very sad. There's a lot of anxiety in the end of the play when these guys have to actually become judges. They're not thrilled about this. They're not like, the general isn't like, great, I have an army now. They're like, ugh. And now I'm tied into this universe of responsibilities and of practical means and ends, which is actually ruining or at least diminishing their pleasure. Because the pure pleasure is in the appearance. So,
But this is only with the general, right? I think, sorry, the other guys there seem to be like still enjoying their real role, sort of as if it was a fantasy,
We would have to look at it more carefully. My impression this time was, when I was reading it again, was that I thought, okay, we'd have to look at the text more carefully, but I thought that they all sort of express a kind of like, this isn't like, to become the actual figure isn't to fulfill their fantasy. It's clearly a step down for them. Because they have their fantasy, that's what the brothel was for. And now they're forced to do this a little bit. Now, they can kind of get into it. They certainly do, because
they come up with another fantasy, that the fantasy of responsibility and so on somehow. So
right, and then we fall into the. I mean, we don't fall, but one of the other things Genet says in his notes about how to play is that you have to maintain this equivocation throughout. You never know if you're in reality or if you're in fantasy. There's maybe one other thing I can add to this. There's a really wonderful passage that I like a lot, and it's about what constitutes the simulation. What constitutes the simulation, right? And there's two elements of every simulation. There's an authentic detail and a fake detail. So you need to have, in order for a simulation to really be a good simulation, you need to have a little detail that sticks out, which shows that you really attended to the precise, so the authentic detail. In the case of the policeman, like with the police chief, when Roger comes to play him, the authentic detail is he knows that he wears a toupee, that he's bald, and he's wearing fake hair, you know, like the fake beard. My friend Gregor here is a beard theorist, so he would appreciate this. He's wearing a fake, and the policeman's like, how does he know that I have a toupee? And the guy's like, well, everybody knows. But this is like but there has to be an authentic detail, and then there has to be a fake detail. So the authentic detail ratifies the fact that the image truly corresponds to reality. And the fake detail ratifies the fact that the image, after all, is an image and doesn't fall into reality. So one example, the example that they're discussing is like a more banal example of just a man cheating on his wife. The authentic detail, what she has to have this certain ring, and then the fake detail is there'll be black lace underneath the kind of normal skirt. There'll be something out of place. That's very funny in theory of the image. So there has to be something that ratifies that the image corresponds to reality, and something that reminds you that after all it's just an image, so it doesn't fall into reality. And you know, one of the other things that Genet is pointing out, I mean, he's showing how most real, let's say, reality needs some kind of fantasy and a fantasy of transgression in order for reality to work. And that fantasy of transgression, which seems to go against the order, is in fact internal to the order. So this fantasy of transgression. And the very simple example, I mean, okay, I'll just read that very fast, but Irma and Carmen are discussing. And Carmen says, you know, when they're with their wives whom they love, do they keep a tiny, small-scale version of their revels in a brothel? Irma, Carmen, excuse me, madam, in a house of illusions. That's what they call it, the maison d'illusion, this house of illusions. It's also, I think that's also an old kind of polite French term for brothel, or at least that's what Genet is constantly playing on. Anyway, he says, I would say, do they keep their revels in the house of illusions tucked away in the back of their heads in miniature form, far off, but present? And Irma says, it's possible, child, no doubt they do. And a very nice image, like a Chinese lantern left over from a carnival and waiting for the next one, or if you prefer, like an imperceptible light in the imperceptible window of an imperceptible castle that they can enlarge instantly whenever they feel like going there to relax. And this would be somehow the definition of fantasy. That as long as you, so in the kind of bourgeois, like you can be with your wife, but you have this little grain of fantasy, which is the imperceptible light in the imperceptible window of an imperceptible castle that can instantly be enlarged. And as long as you have that kind of practically non-existing light, you can, you know, support the reality you live in. So this is somehow also the theme throughout the play, is to show this kind of fantasy space that's not like an escape from reality. So then the question that arises, and then I come, you know, of course the obvious question, but you have to treat it very delicately or very subtly, is, well, how do we escape from that? And immediately you say, well, that desire for escape is kind of telegraphed by that system. Like the bourgeois adulterer, or like also Carmen in the play will say that she has a young daughter who's like in a nursery somewhere in the city, and she just wants to join that daughter. But of course, as Irma points out, this fantasy of joining the daughter is actually what sustains her in the fact that she will never leave the brothel. So is there somehow a real escape? And the only thing I can come up with at this point from Genet is somehow that very figure of the balcony in the balcony is at least that kind of very equivocal point of transition between the two. But it's not like an escape in terms of, you know, I'm going to leave the brothel and go to the city and join the revolution, which is the real escape from them. Because somehow Genet thinks that will never exactly work, or will, okay, sorry, going on.
Actually, it's been a while since I read this play, so I don't, not this one, but the one I'm going to mention, but structurally, Jeunesse play reminds me of Alain Badiou's what was it, Tragedy in Antioch? I think it's a play from the late 60s.
From who?
Alain Badiou.
Oh, okay. I don't
Tragedy in
know. I
Antioch.
actually don't know his. I don't know his theater work. So. Yeah,
I mean, it's less interesting in terms of its nuances, but again, you have the same cycle where sort of the revolutionary overturns the old order, and then he becomes the new police, the new king, and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering, perhaps, like the issue is that when the king's head is cut, it's always when it rots materially, its reverberations become phantasmic and constitute a spirit. That's how the ossification as an image takes place, upon which the new social structures constitute themselves, repeating the old ones. And I don't like, it's just a question, maybe the head has never been allowed to rot materially or properly.
It reminds me also, it just reminds me immediately of a specific line in the play where you have this odd character, I mentioned him, of this beggar. So the one who's actually going downwards, not like for the glory. And he becomes a slave to the police chief. And he says, you know, what he wants to do in this final scene, it's an incredible line where he just says, I'm here to rot. Like you say, I'm here to rot, and the problem is, of course, life is pushing me on, but I just tried to stand here and rot. And it's interesting that maybe this weird character of the beggar turned slave, who also in the end also becomes a poet, because he's also saying that he's going to sing about the police chief. So this kind of low character tries to incarnate what you said, like just to be like a pure loss somehow. That even though life, he has this life in him, but too bad. I mean, he would like to just be immobile and like sink. I think the other image is just, can I sink into the ground? I don't know exactly what to do with that yet, but I find it very interesting in the play that you have these double movements of the ascension into the heaven, you know, this glorification of the image, but also the character who would like sink into the ground. But okay, it's a bit of a free association to your question.
Running short on time, but then one more question, and then we go to Marx.
Yes, thank you. I just want to have a clarification. I wanted to know why the police was something dirty. Why no one wanted to play? Like, I mean, why would the police speak pleasure or jouissance or whatever? Because it's obvious to me the police can be very, you know, in a phantasmical way, pleasurable, you know, play or something. So I don't know what would justify this like exclusion of police from fantasy.
Yeah.
And concerning what you said, like, you know, both the inside and the outside are kind of games or theaters. Maybe the gunshots have something to say about the differentiation between these two, in the sense that, what if the only difference between the outside and the inside is that, or death, outside you can die in the game of reality, and inside in the brothel you're not going to die. I mean, that's kind of maybe that's part of the pleasure itself. I don't know. I'm just thinking. Right. The gunshots kind of.
Let me take up the police. Well, it's separate questions. The police is a very good question. You know, I don't know. That's the premise of the play. That the police will not be imitated. And again, I can just reiterate. You know, I also try to understand that. You could also say, if we just abstract from the play, I don't know. Maybe there are people who want to be policemen. I mean, although there is something kind of, maybe, I don't know, if we just reflect on, there's something kind of interesting that, like, I don't know, the little kids, is that a kind of, is that a seductive image? Maybe. So maybe in a way, Genet has it wrong, or the policeman could be also, you could, you know, dress up and play the cop. But, okay, why does it make sense in the play, we could ask? I mean, and the best I can do there is, you seem to think that there's different symbolic functions with these kind of detachable images, and that they can be enjoyed in a kind of pure sense. But the police seems to stand for, in the play, the last resort of the power of the state. So the state is held together by its aura of authority, and the fact that there's an enjoyment in those rules. But when the revolution comes, the last resort, so like, people getting shot, this is the job of the cops, even more than
This is
the
what
army.
Lacan says. This is Lacan's precise reading.
Right,
That all power comes down to power of fists.
right,
This is why the chief of police, is not a fantasy of power, but power itself.
right. So,
That's why his position is different to those of judge, bishop.
But, en revanche, but, on the other hand, then what's funny is the police ends up becoming the image of all other images. So insofar as somehow the police would be the pure power of the state in terms of people getting shot, beat up, and whatnot, that the only appropriate image for the police then would be this pure phallic image, so the naked image. Not the kind of the image that just shows what an image is at base, that he somehow becomes the image of all other images. And that's why he, incarnates the phallus. And the phallus precisely is something, castrated. Something like that. And I think that's Lacan's reading. That so there has to be a funny short circuit between, let's say, who really holds power and the fact that this power is not glorified or becomes glorified in a very vulgar way. And this vulgarity, so is part of the comedy in terms of, lifting, if you were trying to lift the veil behind the power of the state, maybe you put it that way. Since comedy is about sort of, let's say, lifting the veil behind an idealized image. So if we lift the veil, what we find is the penis as a kind of, what we find is the cop as a kind of dickhead in that sense, behind the power of the state. But, and that's by doing that, we don't necessarily destroy his aura. We don't necessarily destroy the state by doing that. That's also Genet's kind of right post. When the policeman says, look, I'm still intact, even though you've castrated yourself. So when we come back to Nadi's question.
We come back in session 2 and 3. 2 remarks maybe. We can think of images which are performed politically but cannot be represented. So think of images beyond representation, which is of course another lead towards think of repetition beyond or before representation. This will be the discussion for sure in session 3 today. So we come back to this anyways. 2 other remarks as a transition maybe to a Marxian theme. Of course you can say the figures that they are, well, power forces the brothel figures to become identical with the roles. It's basically kind of ironic version of what capitalism does if people have to become the character masks they are performing in capitalism. The famous metaphor Marx uses, which is actually not a metaphor, it's actually more radical. The character mask, if you take the character mask away, there is nothing beyond, nothing behind. You have to fuse it. So that's basically the uncanny irony of capitalism. Otherwise it would be easy to lift the Greek mask and the real empirical actor would come to the front and would do the revolution. Which again is another version of the problem of fantasy and reality are intertwined in a way or are basically support each other, that you can't either say you can have a clear distinction or everything is the same more or less. And the other one, of course, I could not help by thinking of Marx, the young Marx in 1844, Paris manuscripts. Short definition of capitalism, the transition from the particular prostitution of marriage to universal prostitution of wage labor. This is the short definition of what wage labor is as alienated, capitalist alienated labor. And you can read it in both ways, of course, which is also kind of been lurking in the back of that play. But for now, I would say we need to have some kind of base, a common ground from where we can expand in the session 2 and 3. Let's have a reading of some passages. I know you all know that text, but still, it as a certain reminder of what we are talking about. We are back in the early 1850 years. Marx reflections, bitter, very pointed reflections on the failed 1848 revolution and why that was a farce of 1789, the glorious days, the heroic days of the bourgeois revolution. We will basically play in the references Marx is referring to, Hegel and the earlier young Marx. And maybe you will join me. We have all the text, I think, on the computer, either on a copy. Tell me if you need another copy, then we read it in maybe 4 or 5. I mean, you can also sit if you cannot be understood by basic. I think it's better to join.
Who do you want to join you?
Yeah. Come. All who want to join me, please. Let's read the text. Let's perform the text and give it a voice.
I can read.
By the way, before we, Genet session is not done, Aaron. I think also for us at AUB, we should think about a seminar about this play. I think there are so many references and reverberations. I don't even think about the situation in Egypt today. And play this, it's almost uncanny how many references you get.
Yes, that's what I was struck.
It is almost,
the triumph of this chief of police is...
It's too contemporary.
Yes.
You cannot even
terrible.
make a reference. You cannot even apply it to reality. It's more real than reality. So we should get back to this. So, but without further ado, please, who wants to have the famous opening line that you all know about? Gregor, Jan, let's start. I will get my copy of Hegel. Okay, I'm faster. Hegel remarks. Okay, we are in the beginning line. Can we get the copy? By the way, everybody who was subscribed to how to be the teacher to this workshop has a download link sent into my email where you have access to all literature we are discussing. Who has one next? Okay.
Can someone share?
Let's do the following. Let's share, because I cannot, I will go and I will remind me in the break, we'll do some copies, but for now, let's share. No, share. Share with you.
Thank you.
I also have a copy I can...
But remind me in the break, we will do some other copies for you, it's no problem. But you all have access to also Genet's play, Alenka Zupancic's book is all on the Dropbox. So if you want to reread it afterwards. 80s premiere. Hegel remarks somewhere, section 1. Hegel remarks somewhere that all facts and personages of great importance in world history occur, as it were, twice. He forgot to add, the first time as tragedy, the second as farce. Fausidière for Breton, Louis Blanc for Robespierre, the Montagne of 1848 to 1851, for the Montagne of 1793 to 1795, the nephew for the uncle. And the same caricature, of course, in the circumstances attending the second edition of the 18th Brumaire. Quick reminder of historical circumstances. Napoleon III, the fake Napoleon, self-acclaimed, what was he, nephew for the uncle, the real Napoleon as the fake Napoleon, as the fake emperor, was the result of the revolution, the failed revolution of 1848. This is Marx's reflection. Hegel remarks somewhere, I think more or less everybody knows that reference, but for the sake of the quote, I will just read it out. It's from Hegel's famous, infamous philosophy of history. It's a section on the Punic Wars, on basically Roman history, where Hegel comes up with a strange comparison, or like comparison of Roman history and modern history. And in this section, he writes, possessed by this remarkable hallucination, Brutus, the one who killed Caesar, Brutus, a man of highly noble character, and Cassius, endowed with greater practical energy than Cicero, assassinated the man whose virtues they appreciated, Julius Caesar. But it became immediately manifest that only a single will could guide the Roman state. Now the Romans were compelled to adopt that opinion. Since in all periods of the world, a political revolution is sanctioned in men's opinions, when it repeats itself. Thus Napoleon was twice defeated and the Bourbons twice expelled. And now comes the sentence. This is the sentence you find it on Dropbox as well. By repetition, that which at first appeared merely a matter of chance and contingency becomes a real and ratified existence. This is the passage Marx refers to. Somewhere Hegel said. Okay, this is the first, the opening line, but let's go on with the next. Someone else wants? Sure. Men make.
Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. And just when they seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something that has never yet existed, precisely in such periods of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to serve to their service and borrow from their names, battle cries, and costumes in order to present the new scene of the world history in this time-honored disguise, in this borrowed language. Thus Luther donned the mask of Apostle Paul. The revolution of 1789 to 1814 draped itself alternately as the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. And the revolution of 1848 knew nothing better to do than to parody now 1789. Now the revolutionary tradition of 1793 to 1795. In like manner, a beginner who has learned a new language always translated back to his mother tongue. But he has assimilated the spirit of the new language and can freely express himself in it, only when he finds his way in it without recalling the old and forgets his native tongue in the use of the new.
Okay, let's break briefly here. That we're almost halfway through a third of the passage that I would like us to read. I mean, you can throw in some remarks. I will just start. I won't explain it, but just for us to memorize Marx's reference to revolutionary crisis and anxiety. Anxiously conjuration out of anxiety. Spirits of the past, maybe that we have to distinguish from ghosts. Specters, remember Derrida. Nightmare, what is the nightmare that weighs on the brain of the living? Here maybe a philological explanation. Nightmare in German is Albtraum. Albtraum is basically an elf dream. In Germanic mythology, an elf is a little creature that sits on your chest and presses you while you are sleeping. And that creates the pressure, the weight that is on you. So it's literal and to be understood. Later, we might even relate this to Benjamin and a kind of an inverse version when the weight that is a heavy weight that is oppressive can also be understood messianically as a kind of addressing of the past to the present. It can be, or is it historical trauma? There are many ways to read this, but it's a very important passage. And then, of course, we already go into the farcical and the distinction of what could be farce, what could be comedy, what could be tragedy. Marx also introduces the word parody, so pretty close to farce, as the revolution of 1848, nothing better to do than parody of 1789, the real French Revolution. And I mean, you can, Aaron, if you want, next one. That's the consideration.
Maybe in addition to that, just
Okay.
maybe to the Benjamins, actually, creating something that has never existed before. In a sense, Benjamin will turn that around a little bit, by actually repeat.
Don't steal the argument now. Yeah. It will, of course.
No, because it's,
Cut it
it's
out.
already here.
Can I add something?
Spoiler.
Can I add something with regard to Hegel?
Yes, please.
Hegel has, in Phenomenology of Spirit, he has this idea that you have to read philosophical sentences twice, not only once. And I think it's basically the same position that he's arguing here in the context of the philosophy of history. What he means to say, of course, is a well-known claim of Hegel that philosophical sentences, the first time you read them, don't really make sense because for Hegel, philosophical sentences are never something like Caesar died in the year of, I don't know when he died, at some point he died, or 2 + 2 is 4. I mean, this is what separates philosophy from mathematics. Mathematics can say things like 2 + 2 is 4, whereas for philosophy this has no truth value. Anyway, in the second reading of the sentence, or in the repetition of the sentence, you get to the philosophical truth, which is always beyond that simple assertion of when Caesar died. So the philosophical point that the philosophical point for Hegel is that Caesar had to die in order for the idea of the empire to be born. So that's the philosophical point, and this is of course directly related to his remarks in the philosophy of history. Just wanted to add that.
I think it's interesting in this, just on sort of on a different topic, but in this opening part, how our relationship to the past is both one of anxiety, that it's a nightmare, but it's also the thing we run to, right, when something new is about to happen. How you're just opening this up with that sort of dual relationship of anxiety, but also it's our fantasy or comfort at the same time.
We don't need to discuss it now, but it's a very, very tricky comparison with language. We all have to think about this at a later stage. We translate back into the old language, our mother tongue, and then we learn a new language. Is this actually how we learn languages, and what does this tell us about the translatability of the past into the present? It's a very, very tricky image, I think, but I'll leave it there for the moment. We will get further in the next paragraph.
So can I just add, to add to your point, so it's about that history will come to present us with a rational process retrospectively from the position of philosophy, right? Is this what you were trying to...
Yes, sorry, I was maybe not really eloquent about that.
So I think it's a very important point, though.
I mean,
say more about it.
And it's also a very different concept of repetition than the one Marx presents here. Actually, Hegel has his own concept of repetition. Maybe that's what I wanted to say, actually, which is that Hegel did not forget anything. It's Marx's. Well.
I think Marx knows that.
All right. I'll agree with that. I'll agree with that. I'll agree with that. I'll just say that that Hegel does have a concept of repetition. It's just different from that of Marx. I mean, that's the whole point, I guess, I'm trying to make.
Well, could I not just make a very stupid sounding distinction? But it seems like if we just look at these texts, Hegel is talking about repetition as a kind of ratification. So once it's repeated, you know something really happened. You know, it's not enough for Caesar, but also you need Augustus, for instance. But in Marx, repetition, at least your first reaction is repetition is a degradation. I mean, of course, it's more complex, but the basic thrust will be, it repeats, and the second time it's degraded into farce. What was first? That's, I don't know. That's an interesting starting point. Maybe that's a bit like flat-footed. But indeed, you first having Hegel that like the repetition really like hammers the nail, you know. Then it ratifies something. It ratifies that actually something authentically happened. It was an event and not just an accident.
But listen, you know what? What you said about comedy and the difference to farce would then be our task. Actually, our task would be to take to take both Hegel's point and Marx's point, and to add them up somehow, so that the Marxian repetition is not just a mere farce, but a concept, kind of a concept which then deserves the name of comedy.
This will be in session 2. We don't have to solve all questions in this session. I just want to read it. So I have to play.
Do you want to relay it? I feel like I already read.
Let's move on. Just that we have all the bases, give all interpretations later.
I passed because I feel like I just read it.
You read already, you did your job. Next one.
Consideration, yes?
Yes. Go paragraph.
Consideration of this conjuring up of the dead of world history reveals at once a salient difference. Camille Desmoulins, Danton, Robespierre, Saint-Just, Napoleon, the heroes as well as the parties and the masses of the old French Revolution performed the task of their time in Roman costume and with Roman phrases, the task of unchaining and setting up modern bourgeois society. The first one knocked the feudal basis to pieces in mode of the feudal heads which had grown up. The other recreated inside France the conditions under which alone free competition could be developed, parceled, landed, property exploited, and the unchained industrial productive power of the nation employed. And beyond the French borders, he everywhere swept the feudal institutions away so far as was necessary to furnish bourgeois society in France with a suitable up-to-date environment on the European continent. The new social formation, once established, yet antediluvian colossi disappeared, and with them resurrected Romanity. The Brutuses, Gracchi, Publicolas, the tribunes, the senators, and Caesar himself. Bourgeois society in its sober reality had begotten its true interpreters and mouthpieces in essays, Cousins, Royard, Benjamin Constant, and Rousseau. Its real military leader sat behind the office desk, and the hawk-headed Louis XIV was its political chief. Wholly absorbed in the production of wealth and in peaceful competitive struggle, it no longer comprehended that ghosts from the days of Rome had watched over its cradle. But unheroic as bourgeois society is, it nevertheless took heroism, sacrifice, terror, civil war, and battles of people to bring it into being. And in the classically austere traditions of the Roman Republic, its gladiators found the ideals and the art forms, the self-deceptions that they needed in order to conceal from themselves the bourgeois limitations of the content of their struggles and to keep their enthusiasm on the high plane of the great historical tragedy. Similarly, at another stage of development, a century earlier, Cromwell and the English people had borrowed speech, passions, and illusions from the Old Testament for the bourgeois revolution. When the real aim had been achieved, when the bourgeois transformation of English society had been accomplished, Locke supplanted Habakkuk. Further?
One quick reminder again, the metaphor of language is about also in this paragraph, true interpreters, you see that, it's Dolmetscher, it's basically translators. The true translators and mouthpieces. It's the same metaphor Marx goes on. But let's go on.
Thus, the awakening of the dead and those revolutions served the purpose of glorifying the new struggles, not of parodying the old, of magnifying the given task imagination, not of fleeing from its solution in reality, or fighting once more the spirit of revolution, not of making its ghost walk about again.
Here we need to break and to highlight this short paragraph. I think you all got it. We have a different form of repetition. Thus, awakening of the dead in those revolutions served the purpose of glorifying the new struggles, not of parody we had just before. Parody was 48 of 89, so as kind of a superficial reading of Marx' 18th Brumaire, oh, he's against repetition, against farce, he wants the new, he doesn't take into account that there is a kind of a good, proper way of repeating the past in order to arrive at the new. We will go exactly back to this question when discussing Alenka Supancic, but just to highlight this in your versions, in your text, glorifying the new struggles, not of parodying the old, finding once more the spirit of revolution, and highlight once more the spirit of revolution, once more the new. Revolution is always the new, but revolver also means going back and forth, turning around, and not of making its ghost walk about again. And in the German it says den Geist. Okay, ghost, you can't really tell it apart. Ghost and spirit should be actually distinguished. Ah, no, it is. Ghost, Geist and Gespenst. So, spirit is Geist, of course, the good one. Spirit of revolution, that's the Hegel one, Geist. And ghost here is exactly spectre, that's Gespenst. So, you see, ghost can be the good repetition in order to get the new. Spectre, Gespenst, or ghost would be the farcical one. Just to see the linguistic distinction. Very good translation though.
Gespenst would be the betrayal.
Exactly. Gespenst is the farcical one. Spirit of revolution, and not of making its ghost, Gespenst, spectre, walk about again. Right. So this is also rendered fully in the English translation. Fine. Okay, so next one I would already say. And again, I tell you, look at the language metaphor, it comes back. Yeah, we're almost there.
Should I read?
Please, yes.
From 1848 to 1851, only the ghost of the old revolution walked about. From Maros, the Républicain en Grand Jeune, I'm sorry for my terrible friend, Jean Jeune. All right.
Yellow.
Republican in kid gloves. Who disguised himself as the Old Bailey, down to the adventurer who hides his commonplace repulsive features under the iron death mask of Napoleon. An entire people which had imagined that by means of a revolution it had imparted to itself an accelerated power of motion, suddenly finds itself set back into a defunct epoch. And in order that no doubt as to the relapse may be possible, the old dates arise again, the old chronology, the old names, the old edicts, which had long become a subject of antiquarian erudition, and the old minions of the law who had seemed long decayed. The nation feels like that mad Englishman in Mellon, who fancies that he lives in the times of the ancient pharaohs, and daily bemoans the hard labor that he must perform in the Ethiopian mines as a gold digger, immured in this subterranean prison, a dimly burning lamp fastened to his head, the overseer of the slaves behind him with a long whip, and at the exits, a confused welter of barbarian mercenaries who understand neither the forced laborers in the mines nor one another, since they speak no common language. And all this is expected of me, sighs the mad Englishman. Of me, a freeborn Briton, in order to make gold for the old pharaohs, in order to pay the debts of the Bonaparte family, sighs the French nation. The Englishman, so long as he was in his right mind, could not get rid of the fixed idea of making gold. The French, so long as they were engaged in revolution, could not get rid of the memory of Napoleon, as the election of December 10 proved. They hankered to return from the perils of revolution to the flesh pots of Egypt, and December 2nd, 1851 was the answer. They have not only a caricature of the old Napoleon, they have the old Napoleon himself, caricatured as he must appear in the middle of the 19th century. The social revolution of the 19th century cannot draw its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped off all superstition in regard to the past. Earlier revolutions required recollections of past world history in order to drug themselves concerning their own content. In order to arrive at its own content, I'll read this again. In order to arrive at its own content, the revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead. There, the phrase went beyond the content. Here, the content goes beyond the phrase.
Yeah, this is another famous quote that will also be discussed in the afternoon. Caricature we already had. Now we have again phrase versus content, especially its own content. And if the revolution wants to arrive at its own content, let the dead bury their dead. And we already know that this is very difficult because the men make their own history, but they do not do it as they please, as they wish, because the history of all generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So how to get rid of this pressure, this nightmare, in order to let the dead bury the dead and not to be compelled into eternity to play the parody, be the caricature, be a farcical repetition that can never arrive at its own content. But always forget, the picture is more complicated. It's not repetition versus originality. As we know, there's the third repetition, borrowing the costumes in order to make the spirit of revolution walk once again, and not as a walking Gespenst, spectre. So we already have complicated the picture quite a lot. And we know also what is the problem. But Marx, it's a beautiful formulation. Let the dead bury their dead. So you can even say a true revolution is actually also giving a proper burial to all the walking Gespenster, specters. But just that aside,
We are you supporting.
I know. Exactly, I should shut up. Let's go on. We are almost there. The next one. Nadia?
Well, can I make a meta comment? I just can't resist. But, there's a certain difficulty of doing this. I'll just let you in on the secret. If you want to do a kind of workshop in the reading of text, there's a certain kind of art to it, right? It's not so easy. And you already see this basically if you've read too much, let's say every minute. So the problem is, how do you read the text? Because the text presents itself as something new right now. We're just going to read it together. And then it's just it's something new for us. That we don't. But on the other hand, you can already see by the kind of interventions that the weight of all of our reading kind of weighs like a nightmare on our ability to interpret it. No, I'm being slightly serious. So that in the sense that as soon as you want to make an intervention, just to, let's say if I want to comment on the text, of course, it's a little difficult because you comment on the text, but with, let's say, all of your foreknowledge of the history of the text and also the future of that text, so how it's been received. And now we're immediately, sort of slightly, in a funny way, having a dialogue about this, because somebody says, okay, but hey, maybe this means X, Y, and Z. Ah, yes, but come on, you're spoiling it, because you're going to bring in something that later. So immediately, I'm sorry, I'm not making fun, but you see, it's kind of performing this problem of, so we're not making a revolution, we're just stupid philosophers, but just to read the text is also somewhat, maybe is somewhat problematic here, because, how do you read this text freshly
It's impossible.
It's impossible, but of course, but of course, then there's a certain ethic or a certain art of doing it. It might not be, I don't know, that's a crazy, it might not be so far away from the ethics, of how do you do a revolution.
Yes.
In the sense, because you have to deal with the way the tradition is weighing on you and all of your knowledge. Does that help you? Does that
Yeah,
help
but
you? Okay, sorry, but it's, you know what I mean? Like the way we intervene is also like,
we must not be.
we know Benjamin, but okay, but let's just read Marx for his, we know Lacan, but how do we read without immediately the conversation becoming moral?
Exactly, but we must not be naive and claim that we can have like a neutral ground and leave all that we know behind and
Exactly,
some kind
so.
of authentic,
That's
but
Farce.
we can sort of interrupt ourselves and produce these moments of repetition and remind ourselves that we are also repeating something.
Oh, sure. I mean, think of the opening of Althusser, Lire de Capital. As good Catholics, they confess a sin. Yeah, of course. We are all philosophers. We are reading the text as philosophers. This is basically what we have to confess here. We did the confession.
Yeah, I mean,
It's on the video.
Already.
We confess. But sure, I'm not faking that I have never read this text, but seriously, most times I read it in German. So it's a kind of strange alienation effect from. By the way, Marx supervised the English translation and the French translation. And it was done for English language newspaper. It was for, what's this newspaper in New York that Marx was always writing for to get some money?
Oh, the Radish or whatever.
I forgot it, but that was basically freelance journalism. So the English version is supervised by, authorized by Marx. Okay, maybe because we're getting very close to the end, like Piccolo, Six Salta, this is as far as I would like to come in this section. Maybe we can do it in one row.
The February Revolution was a surprise attack, a taking of the old society unawares, and the people proclaimed this unexpected stroke as a deed of world importance, ushering in a new epoch. On December 2nd, the February Revolution is conjured away by a card sharper's trick, and what seems overthrown is no longer the monarchy, but the liberal concessions that were wrung from it by centuries of struggle. Instead of society having conquered a new content for itself, it seems that the state only returned to its oldest form, to the shamelessly simple domination of the saber and the cow. This is the answer to the coup de main of February 1848, given by the coup de tête of December 1851. Easy come, easy go. Meanwhile, the interval of time has not passed by unused. During the years 1848 to 1851, French society has made up, and that by an abbreviated because revolutionary method, for the studies and experiences which in a regular, so to speak, textbook course of development would have had to precede the February Revolution, if it was to be more than a ruffling of the surface. Society now seems to have fallen back behind its point of departure. It has in truth first to create for itself the revolutionary point of departure, the situation, the relations, the conditions under which alone modern revolution becomes serious. Bourgeois revolutions, like those of the 18th century, storm swiftly from success to success. Their dramatic effects outdo each other. Men and things seem set in sparking brilliance. Ecstasy is the everyday spirit, but they are short-lived. Soon they have attained their zenith, and a long, crapulent depression lays hold of society before it learns soberly to assimilate the results of its storm and stress period. On the other hand, proletarian revolutions, like those of the 19th century, criticize themselves constantly, interrupt themselves continually in their own course, come back to the apparently accomplished in order to begin it afresh, deride with unmerciful thoroughness the inadequacies, weaknesses, and paltrinesses of their first attempts, seem to throw down their adversary only in order that he may draw new strength from the earth, and rise again, more gigantic before them, recoil ever and anon from the indefinite prodigiousness of their own aims, until a situation has been created which makes all turning back impossible, and the conditions themselves cry out, here is the rose, here dance.
Great. Thanks. Again, we will come back to this part when we read Alenka Zupancic on comedy. Just a reminder again, we have two forms of revolutions here, bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century and proletarian revolutions of the 19th century. And obviously in their way of proceeding there is a difference. One, the former, they run swiftly from success to success, but the effects outdo each other. And the other one is a very strange one. And we should just keep it in mind. I don't offer any interpretation. We should read this later again. Proletarian revolutions, like those of the 19th century, and then criticize themselves constantly, interrupt themselves continually in their own course, come back. Think of the Latin word of revolver, revolution. Come back to the apparently accomplished in order to begin it afresh, derived with unmerciful thoroughness in the inadequacies, weaknesses, and poisonnesses of their first attempt. So there's a second, obviously, and a third, and so on attempt, and so on. They drew new strands from the more giant until a situation has been created which makes all turning back impossible, whatever that is, and the conditions themselves cry out. So
here maybe we have the theory of our own reading.
maybe, but without offering an interpretation, this last form of what Marx aimed at, the real new revolution that led the dead, buried the dead, the proletarian revolution of the 19th century, is also something very akin to, seems it has a repetitive mode, but of a different kind. We may keep this in mind. It's not totally the opposite of repetition. Probably not tragedy, maybe comedy, hopefully not farce, but just to keep in mind, we have tragedy. Always history as twice, once as tragedy, then as farce. Then we have caricature, repetitions, and parody, which is more on the farcical side. Then we have something, Marx doesn't give a name for it, but says these are true, proper conjurations to make the spirit of revolution, the guys walk again, not walk, let the spectre walk, like the Gespenst. And the bourgeois revolutions obviously have two versions. They have the farcical one and the one where they properly resurrected the spirit geist of revolution. And now we have a third version that is offered. We can even say a zero version, which was Greek tragedy and so on, for sure. But in modern times we have a third version that's alluded here in the last section, proletarian revolution of the 19th century. And what they do, I think we should leave up for discussion for the afternoon. And of course the word is to all of the panelists again. If we still have a little bit of time, because it would make sense as a preparation for the later readings to have two more paragraphs, very short. From Marx's, this is 1850, when was it written? 2? 3? Marx's 18th Brumaire, in the first half of the 1850s written. An earlier text of Marx, very famous as well, from 1843, Marx's famous text on contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, the introduction, the book has never been written, makes a similar claim under different historical circumstances. There, the distinction is not tragedy and farce, but comedy. Tragedy and comedy. We should maybe read these two together to get the three forms of repetition that we have here in this text. So again, this text is not against repetition per se, but there are different forms of repetition, of conjuring. We have the opposition of spectre Gespenst, ghost, and Geist, spirit, and we have a different form of repetition. And maybe I will start, if this is okay, and then Rachel does the second, because you brought me.
What part do you want to
reading it again? It is on page 4 of the other text that is also on the Dropbox. It's called Marx, the Contribution to the Critique of the Philosophy of Right. It's also online for those who have internet access. It's on Marx's org.
The struggle?
Yeah, this is struggle. Yeah, this is struggle. So, earlier in the text, Marx ruthlessly criticizes the German situation, basically the German situation, unlike the French, you know. In the 18th primaire, he's criticizing France mainly, but in this earlier text, he's totally upset about the situation in Germany. Don't forget, Prussia is the state of restoration against the French Revolution. Napoleon was defeated, we had restoration, Vienna Congress, and also the Rhine area where Marx was born was annexed by Prussia. So the German situation is below the level of world history. However, you can have the measurement of what is below and what is avant-garde. And so he starts. This struggle, it's a struggle of politics and criticism, against the limited content of the German status quo, 1843, cannot be without interest even for the modern nations, for the German status quo is the open completion of the Ancien Regime, and the Ancien Regime is a concealed deficiency of the modern state. The struggle against the German political present is the struggle against the past of the modern nations, and they are still burdened with reminders of that past. It is instructive for them to see the Ancien Regime, which has been, through its tragedy with them, playing its comedy as a German revenant. Tragic indeed was the pre-existing power of the world, and freedom, on the other hand, was a personal notion. In short, as long as it believed and had to believe in its own justification, as long as the Ancien Regime, as an existing world order, struggled against a world that was only coming into being, there was on its side a historical error, not a personal one. That is why its downfall was tragic, the downfall of Ancien Regime. And now, Rachel, you can take that.
On the other hand, the present German regime, an anachronism, a flagrant contradiction of generally recognized axioms, the nothingness of the ancient regime exhibited to the world, only imagines that it believes in itself and demands that the world should imagine the same thing. If it believes in its own essence, would it try to hide that essence under the semblance of an alien essence and seek refuge in hypocrisy and sophism? The ancient regime is rather only a modern Ancien regime is only the comedian of the world order, whose true heroes are dead. History is thorough and goes through many phases when carrying an old form to the grave. The last phase of a world historical form is its comedy. The gods of Greece, already tragically wounded to death in Aeschylus' tragedy Prometheus Bound, had to re-die a comic death in Lucian's dialogues. Why this course of history? So that humanity should part with its past cheerfully, this cheerful historical destiny in which we vindicate for the political authorities of Germany.
So we have now our third version.
That's very funny.
Yes, it's very funny, and also don't read the earlier text into the later text, as some scholars do. They just say, comedy. Comedy is farce, and then they're finished. Tragedy, comedy, or tragedy and farce, and map the two texts onto each other. We should not do this. We just keep in mind, Hegel said, by repetition that which at first appeared merely as a matter of chance and continuity becomes a real ratified existence. Napoleon had to basically be defeated twice. Then Marx says in 1843, this is the way how humanity, basically, or world history, carries an old form to its deathbed. World history has to be repeated as comedy. And so the German state, the German modern ancien regime, like this remainder of the old, must be the comedy of the old, real French ancien regime. It is the comedy, it sounds a bit farcical, but it's the comedy in order to really arrive at the new content. So the Germans, it's kind of a delayed world historical mode of digestion. You know, they're a bit late, but they will get rid of that shit at some point. So it has to be repeated again. Or as, you know, a cow is always chewing, you know, one stomach here, the other one there. So German stomach is a bit later. It must be comical. It's very important. And this is the comparison Marx makes here. Also, it should pass gaily or cheerfully. Heiter in German. Heiter is also what comes up in Benjamin, of course. While communism is heiter, or cheerfully, gayfully. Without further interpretation, I think I would like to leave you with this discussion. We have, of course, still roughly half an hour to discuss these three forms, these three texts. And I don't want to generalize them and say they basically say all the same, but we have different forms of history, repetition, tragedy, comedy, and farce. And the floor is open.
Just a very first reaction. This reminds me of a figure of comedy that Slavoj Žižek likes to repeat. But it's a very funny notion that, like, first there's some kind of tragic historical struggle, and then comedy is sort of the aftermath of that tragic struggle that hasn't been resolved yet. So the comedy is actually the continual existence of a form whose essence, let's say, or the real struggle behind it no longer exists, but that forms. So it reminds me of that kind of cartoon character who, like, you know, runs off, the bird like runs off the cliff, but still is going in the mid-air because it hasn't realized that it has no ground to stand on yet. So I think Marx is saying something like, comedy for him is always linked to decay. There was a form, there was something tragic about the fact that that form is now broken down, but the form doesn't realize that it's broken down yet, and so its continued existence is just a kind of comical farce. Like, I think there's no difference, at least I don't read any difference here between comedy and farce. Comedy
It's no personal error. The personal error will be, oh, I have not realized I'm already over the cliff. See this last sentence?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. There's a historical error because there's a real substantial, let's say, struggle. There's a historical error, and then, but I don't know if he brings in the personal thing again. It's almost the last phase, like you quote, of a world historical form of its comedy. So it's like the tragedy is the struggle, where something real is at stake, and that's not just about persons, but there's a content, a historic, something with a kind of meaning for a broader historical. But it's like the tragedy, it's already been decided, but the thing doesn't know it's already been decided. So it just lingers on because of, I don't know why, habit, whatever, people clinging to some old form of power, and then it turns into comedy. Would that be correct?
I would, sorry, Rachel. Oh.
Go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to, I think Adam said exactly what I wanted to say, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that this is the same as farce. This is actually, the same image is used by Alenka Zupancic to explain the structural too lateness of comedy, like this comical character which you know just doesn't realize yet that it's already over the cliff. So that's the essence of comedy, and it's very different from just a farcical repetition. I would agree with Sami's sticking to the separate concepts here. And what I would like to add is this idea that I think is in all these Marxist texts really present is the reference to Hegel. Because Hegel, of course, in his philosophy of the right, has the idea, he's the only one who has ever written that philosophy comes too late at this stage. I don't know, maybe going into Marx's 11th thesis of Feuerbach is gonna bring us way too far. But at some point, Marx, this is quite a well-known phrase, right? That philosophers have only ever interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. Well, philosophers have actually never done this. This is something that Mellon often points out. Philosophers have always tried, seen their work as something that is really engaging. Spinoza would write, would make the title of his work Ethics, and would like to think of his work as something revolutionary, transformatory. And like the ancient practices of philosophy were always practical philosophy, ethical philosophy. Anyway, making the long story short, the only one who ever written that philosophy comes too late was Hegel, and only in the introduction to the elements of philosophy of right. And so Hegel does discuss a certain too lateness of philosophy. But I think what Mellon does at some point, and I think this may be an interesting point, is to say, well, maybe this too lateness of philosophy is actually not, Hegel's point here is not that philosophy just kind of takes the remains and then does something with that, or reflects on reality but not intervene in reality itself. Rather, the point is, what philosophy does is actually closer to what comedy does. This will be what I'm trying to say. So the lateness, structural too lateness of comedy may be related to structural too lateness of philosophy. So that's
the only very quick response is that at least in this text, it seems like Marx is saying that the function of comedy is actually to be a kind of happy morning. So its function is reconciliation. Like happy morning. Humanity should part with the past cheerfully. So it's hard to detach oneself from a form, even when that form has become meaningless, unsubstantial. So it gets a kind of comedy about it, its continued existence, but it shouldn't be there. And then that lets us say goodbye. And we can laugh about it and say goodbye, and we can move on historically. So it's a kind of reconciliation with the real work of tragedy. At least just sticking to the letter of the text here.
If you want to talk about revolution, though, I do think that we have to sort of away sort of a sense of comedy that pertains to sort of a revolutionary repetition of the past. Do maybe want to differentiate sort of that kind of comedy that Marx is talking about in the Critique of Right from that form of comedy. From a Berninian perspective, and I know that you are interested in it, that this sort of structural too lateness of comedy can be seen as sort of what Benjamin calls these demands of the past. But isn't it nonetheless sort of there's a difference between parody and comedy in the Brummerian and the Critique, but also might there not be a difference between this structural too lateness of the comedy of the Ancien Régime and the sort of the comic sort of repetition that is sort of implied in revolutionary repetition? I mean, it's just a question, but because you said let's differentiate, maybe there's another difference between this kind of comedy and sort of.
What is the difference? We will
because
in session 2 we will have the comedy session. Let's stick to the text for a moment.
I would add.
Rachel, yes.
I think the main distinction I see between the first death and the second death of the gods is that in the second death of the gods themselves have to admit that they're dead. And that's the dead burying their own dead. So it's not we who depart from history, but this is history the history that's remaining, that's haunting us, letting go of itself and admitting that it already died, that it's already dead. So there's two kinds of negativity at play. The first death is a kind of negativity that just seems like an opposition against the past, that we're trying to destroy this old tragic phase. But in the second kind of negativity, it's not one of opposition, it's one where the negative sort of realizes itself on a deeper level, I think, and then it realizes that it itself is dead, so it can laugh at its own tragedy, maybe. and then sort of dissipate maybe. Because what's the difference between the death of the gods on the Greek stage and the death of the gods in the Roman world? Is that on the Greek stage we pull the gods out and we torture them and we laugh at them because we're humanity. But then in the Roman world, especially in Christ, you have the Christian God who on the cross says God is dead because God turns against himself. So to me, that's the real comic moment.
I like Greek. Greek better. Shoot.
But you all know that, of course, when we say Greek and we say antiquity, we talk about antiquity as a modern invention. So it is very clear that all these decaying forms, all that can be farce or repetition, in this moment when you make this statement, the old form is basically produced epistemologically. That's very clear. So never read this in a linear way or succession. Once upon a time there was the Greek now tragedy and their stuff is over, and now we have comedy or farce or whatever. Of course not. The very distinction of tragedy and comedy as world historical stages comes only into view once we are already in modernity, and we are, so to speak, the ones who have suffered, in Marxian terms, farce. We have already suffered farce, and then all the distinction, you can say the light spectrum of history, the prism is given only through that, you can say, epistemological, Copernican term of modernity. So this is not linear. So this is so in quotation marks. And this is, of course, why also it is not anachronism or some kind of weird twist in Hegel that he talks about the Punic Wars in Roman Empire, Julius Caesar and so on. And then he comes with Napoleon and makes a general claim about all world history. He can do this precisely because of the modern, because the very idea of history as this kind of succession and repetition is a modern idea anyways. So the ancient Greeks, they had no such thing as our history. Historia is, of course, Latin translation, and they don't. It was a different way. Well, it was a different chronicles in the medieval times. So just keep this in mind. But nevertheless, a tragedy, comedy, and farce cannot be mapped on either, in a chronological sense, modernity versus antiquity. These are modes how history are played out, so to speak, and also give us the distinctions or the theoretical apparatus to render them.
Sammy, just going back to this very simple question, going back to on the text, what do you see as the difference, just because I'm not getting it, the difference between what he calls comedy in this critique text and farce here? Because I'm actually tempted to do what you said not to, which is kind of to merge that thing. Because they're both about a certain degradation. So I'm curious, do you think we should draw a distinction, or what do you think?
Of course, I would first say ask Rachel, because she writes about this. This
Rachel?
Yeah, no, Rachel works on this, so that's very brief. I will only say what we already had. In the farce of Marx, there is bitterness of defeat in after 48. Here he is still laughing, you can say, in 43, making a wager on the revolution where he actually will write the Communist Manifesto for it a couple of years from then. So, of course we can, this would be the easy way out. Oh, it's a biography thing. Once he was young and hopeful, then he was old and bitter and had to study in the British Library 20 years of boring political economy. That's not so easy. The thing is that there is a kind of a modern, non-heroic and even non-cathartic side of laughter and letting go. And what later maybe has a strange revival in Benjamin's modern positive form of barbarism, in this kind of let go and laugh. Let's destroy what is already in the beginning, in the being of decay. There is a certain revolutionary dimension to the comedy here as cheerful, and maybe this cheerfulness is not anymore there. When cheerfulness turns against itself, then you have the farce. So there is a minor distinction, but I give the word to you, Rachel.
Yeah, I think I disagree with you a little bit, maybe on the point of affects, or at least I don't know, I think in Farce, actually, that's when we can have like the most laughter because we feel totally free from the past, and this is a point that Lana Delar makes, and Zupančič, and we'll see that Farce is this feeling of total freedom from the past that, in fact, still has hold over us. So it's this like celebration of the new form, the new historical form, when the content lurking underneath it is the same. So maybe it's like a laughter that comes a little too soon when the joke is on us. And I think real comedy comes the moment when we do realize that we're over the cliff, and then we can fall. So it comes like in the real destruction of falling over the edge. And I don't know what the affect would be in the realization of that moment that I am dead. I think maybe it is one of laughter, but maybe it's also one of terror too. That's why in the 18th Brumaire, Marx says that the moment that something new is about to come, we retreat back, because there is this kind of terror in that moment, I think, when real historical comedy is about to emerge. So I don't know if I take him like to be totally genuine when he says about this cheerful past, this cheerful separation. I tend to think that maybe he's making a joke a little bit about, is it truly just so lighthearted?
Yeah, I mean, what I would ask you back, laughter when the joke is on us in the farce, where basically the bitterness is in the back because the laughter, or we laugh out a little bit too loud. Because actually we know it's about us. And we are basically, the farcical constitution has a deep grip on us. I mean, in a very vulgar way, I would say the everyday living condition in probably this state here is exactly that. You have to laugh out, but you know very well you cannot change it. So the farcical situation, the situation where we say all these old warlords, all these guys from political establishment, come on, that's of course farcical. It's even more farcical than Marx could ever imagine. But they have a grip on us, and the joke is on us, and sometimes it's good to laugh, but you need a lot of alcohol for that. So I still insist that there is a difference in this farcical laughter and the kind of hard, but let's say healthy laughter that can also be a sober laughter in comical repetition, when you basically carry an old outlived form over the cliff. We just heard it to its deathbed, so there might be something. I'm not sure, but I wouldn't have the argument so much on the affective side. Let's look at the structural side. Later, I think you can read it in both ways. You can read it as Farce, the comedy here, but for us, looking at the program of the afternoon and the evening, it would be important to have a structural distinction between farce and comedy, or working towards a different definition. I mean, later Mr. Pančić will do this. Maybe the Marx text, I'm not sure about. You work more on it than I do. Whether really, what is the laughter healthy? Is it also a joke on us? That should be. It can be, of course, discussed.
You know, this paragraph is so good. This paragraph, it makes me think also, well, here's a variation. It makes me think of the Genet. That, like, what would happen? The comedy for Hegel is supposed to be the decaying form that's going to die, and it says it's goodbye. It's a last farewell. But what if that act of decay and dying was just immortalized, eternalized? And I think that's the Genet comedy. You see what I mean? That, like, Genet shows, Hegel is saying that the German state is a joke. It's a joke because it maintains, like, basically the form of the ancien regime in the current, like, bourgeois era, and it's just a joke. It's a comedy. And the true heroes of it are dead. But what if that's actually definitive somehow of the modern state? That, like, it just lives its comic death. And I think that's kind of what Genet is saying, that it shows that, like, this state is a joke, but it lives, and all the characters in the play are always saying they're dead, they're going to die, and that they're desiring immobility and eternity.
But that's not farce.
You know? I don't know. I'm sorry. I just want to stick with this paragraph about comedy because it already gets too complicated for me. Just this paragraph about comedy, this one paragraph. And I was just thinking, like, the Genet in the end is about eternalization of that moment of decay. So we would expect, like Hegel said, that the comedy of this decrepit, ridiculous state of affairs would disappear into something else, and comedy would be our nice reconciliation with that. We could say goodbye with that kind of smile, you know, or make fun of the situation. But in Genet, it seems like no, this comedy we're just stuck in this comedy, which then becomes a nightmare again, you know, because we can't get out of it, or somehow that you have this repetition of this endless. It should disappear, even when castrated. You even castrate the call. He's like, I'm still intact. I don't know. I'm a bit free associating, but I was just, yeah. What if the world historical importance of comedy is actually that something should pass away? But what if that moment itself gets eternalized? Then maybe that's not a bad description of the balcony. Then the question of Farce brings in another thing, but I'm just trying to think of this.
That's a good idea. We should
This one
into
text.
the break what it means, rediacomic death in eternity, because die once more, but in death, in redying, you get into spirit's infinity, one day after the other, and there is no end, no messianic cessation, no arrest. And that is basically then the temporality of Farce. Marx was maybe a bit too optimistic when he thought rediacomic death is once more. Okay, at a second time maybe. But we can really miss the point of the restaging, and then the stage is eternalized, and that maybe can be seen as farce, the temporality of farce, when you have forgotten. Or maybe you're, in the comic picture, you're already over the cliff, you now realize it, now is the moment to fall down. But you already walk too far.
Well, no, you just don't fall down, so you're castrated, but okay. It's still, in other words, in Hegel, you saw this idea that there would be some reconciliation. Genet's point is what you think would have been the end of something is actually its state of positive functioning. So that's why I'm tempted to say you have this internalized moment, which then, of course, becomes a very weird, it's a very bitter comic, it becomes like a nightmare. But it's still comic, because you have the sense that a real substantial struggle that would be tragic is not possible somehow, or the time is past that. And then, how do you think of what a real struggle would be starting from that? Genet's answer is something like, I just expose the whole thing for what it is, and I let it explode like that. If that's sufficient or not, but I just enormously expose the whole thing. But anyway.
It sounds a lot like Dionysus, the eternal death of God.
But that dark, we can have one round before we break into the lunch break. Nadia?
Should we take any questions?
Yes, I would like to. You're always invited to interrupt us.
Just an impulse. I was just wondering whether the difference between comedy and farce can be measured in degrees of detachment. So when you're in comedy, you can't help but notice that you're already detached from that earlier state where everything was, there was no detachment and you couldn't question the status quo. So I was just thinking how that relates to the Genet text. And also, I find the metaphor of the dream interesting, and the repetition of a nightmare. I don't know, I always have to think of Benjamin. But these are just fragments right now, I'm just brainstorming.
Shall we take some more questions?
I have a question. Because you guys have been mentioning Hegel's philosophy of right, but one of the sentences that struck me the most in that book was what is rational is actual and what is actual is rational. And another translation they use becomes rather than is, which I like more. So since we're talking about history as tragedy, comedy and farce, and as you mentioned, Sami, like we are talking about things that have already happened. We're already in the retrospective stage, right? We're not talking about the now, especially with the Minerva example for Hegel. I'm just trying to understand this distinction between tragedy, comedy, and farce, because it seems that all three of them have two-latedness, and all three of them are, they seem like prescriptive judgments of the same action. So where do we start with what was tragic and then became comic in another instance? That's my question.
Somebody else should answer. You should answer.
We have more sessions to answer. There are the hardcore questions. Also the degrees of detachment. Please.
Following up on what Mark said, I just want to know, like, would, for example, the rise of something like ISIS be considered a tragedy, a farce, or a comedy in a historical sense? Like, I want to know. Like,
We will vote on this later, but I think it will be probably farce. But we will.
I think it's even more complicated. It's like a farce, but it touches on a real point. Because it touches on it touches on the real borders, right? It touches on like an interesting point about borders, but in a totally farcical manner. I mean, in a horrible farcical manner. I mean, there's something real in it. It's not that, because it touches on the problem of the post-Sykes-Picot and so forth. So it's a complicated.
But that's the point. I mean, isn't that like what I think Mark was like? Isn't it all about where you start the story, kind of that you judge something to be a farce, a comedy, or a tragedy? It's just about where you pick the starting point of, I don't know, history. I don't know exactly what you say here, but I have that same kind of question, I guess.
Sorry, like, this might seem rude, I don't mean to be rude, but how does this add to the discourse of history, whether you call something a tragedy, a comedy, or a farce? Like, yes, maybe you might understand it in different ways, or it might help you get more in-depth analysis if you decide to label the 1789 revolution as tragedy or comedy, maybe because they were conscious of what they were doing or not, but I don't understand how, because, again, to the Hegel quote of what is rational is action, because these things happen as such, and I'm not saying that we should offer a strictly historicist point of view on what's happened. Yeah.
So why is it a rude question?
Because I don't see the input or the addition that the value added for labeling something as a tragedy, comedy, or farce.
No, but we should keep this in mind. I mean, in the end, on our final discussion, that should be the question. I mean, especially the last pages of the Spanish reading of Marx. You can also say, why all the fuss about that? I mean, history is a stage, sure. They play some tragedy, some farce, some comedy. Why shall we bother to categorize it? What do we learn from it? Is there any pedagogical value from it? Probably none.
Well, there is this old argument, of course, but there is one argument that says, well, that's basically Hegelian, which is that history does come to an end, that there is an end point to history. So this, you know, if you believe that, if you trust Hegel here on this point, then you would see how this becomes relevant for Marxism as well. Because on many levels, this is at least what some random guy, Francis Fukuyama, thought at some point, that well, basically what Marxism, or Marx himself argues for, is that communism is proper end of historical idea. It's like the result of the process of history. And so, you know, how do comedy and tragedy come into play? Well, you know, in this general term, is a way how to see the process of history being displayed in front of our eyes, because we are clearly not in communism yet. Therefore, we need to develop tools to understand what is going on in front of us. And if we do take a look at that as kind of a stage, then we see, all right, so we have seen the feudalism fall, you know, in its own idea as a tragic hero, and then we see this state which you know, has the queen and then the queen on all the pounds and whatever. And I tend to think of it as a farce. So it does help us understand this historical processes, I would say. Though, of course, there are many other approaches that could be. And I'm not even saying that the whole problematic is limited to this, but I mean, Sami mentioned the question that Alenka Zupancic points out, which is the question of subversivity or subversiveness of comedy in general. And that's, you know, it's a completely different perspective on the whole question. But I'm just saying that clearly there are many ways, I think, where these questions are relevant or helpful.
And I would also
And then we have one more last question, or two questions, and then we go into the lunch break.
I don't think judging at historical stage as like tragedy or comedy is for the historian. I think it's these categories are useful for thinking about how our own current stage, being within a certain staging of history, and thinking about how does this stage make sense in relationship to a former stage, whether it's the long past or just the recent past that we're trying to break from right now. And tragedy or comedy is not the staging itself, but how we're relating to that past. And a tragic relationship to another stage of history would be one where we just see our own stage as simply imposed or something. That might be a tragic, like one-sided relationship to history. But maybe comedy occurs when we're trying to make sense of our own historical staging in relationship to another, and we actually allow the present to be transformed through this relationship somehow. So it's about what kinds of repetition we enact through our different understandings of the staging of history, maybe.
Maybe just to add to that, I completely agree with you. It's essentially like ethical questions that we're addressing here. It's not about, you know, the concepts of tragedy and comedy as such. You know, if sort of all our acting is sort of deeply determined by repetition, can we think of a form of repetition that actually does not only repeat but also in repetition changes something? So I think that's sort of with sort of the workshop leading towards the question of comedy. Maybe can we think of comedy as some kind of form of repetition that does actually that demands something new? And, you know, so it's an ethical question basically, not just a description of history. But,
yeah, I just have a comment. I think that's in relation to this comment and what Rachel was earlier talking about, this running off the cliff and that realizing that there is no ground. I feel like there's something at stake, particularly if I'm thinking about, let's say, the radical potential of art, for instance, and, you know, avant-garde movements in particular. Like, I think, I mean, this has come up in some of my classes where we notice that in certain movements or certain artists, there is that particular moment of terror in their, like, really just at the limit of that radical potential of their work, which suddenly, you know, is the moment of their retreat as well. And you know, suddenly they become more conservative. I can't think of a particular example right now, but I feel like there is something at stake in that practically.
I just wanted to add to the question that I think Mark asked about the relevance of defining stages, if they're tragic or comedy. I think this question is like what the 18th Brumaire is about, like why was the bourgeoisie revolutionary in 1789 and why is it now reactionary 50 years later? And what happened during that stage that shifted this revolutionary potential into class interest? That is, so this is not about defining what, if it's tragedy or comedy or farce, it's about defining the class interest and the shift of this class, particular class, and what happened to the peasantry, for example, and made them rally around Napoleon III, and why the peasantry and the Bolshevik Revolution rallied around the proletariat as well. What is this shift and how it happened? This is what defines if it's basically a stage that is worth mentioning or not in its definition of if it's tragedy or comedy or farce. Just to add this one.
I would say, on our lunch break. Do we? Then 2:30 we will reconvene exactly in this room with Jan's paper on Benjamin and Lacan. and all questions that we had will, one way or another, will recur. Thanks so far. Thanks, our